and welcome everyone to our next episode of Big Data Talks, in which we have conversations with industry experts about the way in which data, machine learning, and artificial intelligence are changing the way we live. My name is Jan-Willem Middelburg, and I'm the author of the Enterprise Big Data Framework. It's my great pleasure to host this podcast for you again today. Today, I have the great pleasure to welcoming back Kieran Hagen, who was a panel speaker at this year's Big Data Days 2023 conference, and you might have seen him already before. Kieran is a principal technical sales leader for data, AI, and automation at IBM, and I imagine that has a lot of experience under his belt in these topics, which is one of the key reasons we invited him for today. Kieran has worked with data and data solutions for over 2 decades. In addition, Kieran has a double bachelor's degrees in arts and science from the Australian National University. He's a frequent keynote speaker at webinars, conferences around the world, and on his day job, he's working for IBM to evangelize everything data. Kieran, it's a great pleasure to welcome you back again today. I've really been looking forward to speaking to you. How are you today?
I'm fantastic. Thank you, Jan. It's great to connect with you again. I'm very happy to be talking to you.
Absolutely. So it's a great pleasure to have you back after our previous engagement. And I would like to get started with picking your brain a little bit around the way that you became involved in data. I noticed that you had a bachelor's degree or double even in arts and sciences. So can you tell us a little bit around your story? How did you arrive into the wonderful domain of data?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting journey, Jan, and you created, I guess, a bit of a story there. When I went to university, I combined both arts and science. I had an interest in both fields. So I did a couple of courses in either camp. I did philosophy, sociology, neuroscience, biology. But the one sphere that really grabbed my attention was biological anthropology, so study of human evolution. And what was interesting it's not necessarily the most employable career, but it was certainly interesting. And it was based a lot on the fossil record. And what I realized is a lot of that fossil record has theories and assumptions based on morphology or shape. And I realized that a lot of those elements are really data elements. If you look at the size or structure or shape of tooth, that will create a lineage or a theory of history. And in my studies, I realized that if you could look at the data elements, that could help back up or prove some of these theories. So that was my entry point into multivariate statistics as part of my honours degree. So having completed that, and I had a massive Excel sheet at the end of it. It's almost like an entry point into data analysis.
Yeah.
So when I finished my degree, I actually ended up in a IT traineeship with another company. So I learned computer languages. I worked with data. Originally, I was a software developer. Then I did technical training, which I loved, the education and evangelizing. And then I ended up in technical sales. And that allowed me to combine my interest in technology with that ability to pass on learning and knowledge. And that's what led me to today. It's been a fantastic vocation and a great interest. And it started out by an interest in data and that analysis from my degree.
Very interesting. What I really find interesting that what you're saying is that in technical sales, you're basically educating. I think that's sometimes a little bit misunderstood. It's not always around trying to sell something, but basically explaining what something does so that people have a better understanding of how to do that.
I very much agree. Yeah.
So I think we share a very similar passion there. So then obviously I have to ask, because as soon as you start talking about statistics, I remember my dissertation and it was all SPSS, which is obviously IBM nowadays.
Yeah.
Did you start in that area as well, or?
Yeah, so funnily enough, SPSS has a huge history in academics. Yeah. And when we look at a number of these tools, and I think about the journey even my own son has now, what's interesting is that as an economy or even as a society, we become more data aware. a lot of people, even going through school now, know some coding languages. Might be simple coding clicks through to Python language. Then you might go to statistics, and at the end, there might be data science or something more advanced like that. But it has become really much more accessible, the way that we work and use technology to work with data. And I think AI is a perfect example of an evolution in that space. To me, it's the next stage of that knowledge work that might have begun with spreadsheets many years ago.
I think that evolution, as you rightfully call so, is something that the world has been waiting for quite a long time. We're obviously going to talk about that a lot today because it's on everyone's radar. But before we do that, just let me complete your personal journey. So that helped you end up at IBM. IBM is who doesn't know IBM? One of the leaders in the field of data for many, many years. And within IBM, there's such a massive conglomerate. How do you find your focus on what you do specifically? And what is it that you ended up as, saying, this is my specialty, this is what I want to be the number one leader in?
Yeah, look, in my work in IBM, my day-to-day job is what's called a data, AI, and automation technical sales leader. What that really means is I work with a very large software catalog around data and AI and making that a reality for a lot of businesses and customers. So that role to me combines a couple of things. First, I'm a technologist, right? I love working with tools and technology, and keeping learning and working with those tools maintains our currency, right? And what we can do with those tools. I like to combine that with being an evangelist. So, talking to people, helping them understand what we call the art of the possible, what you can do with those tools. But I'm also a people manager in the business. There are 9 countries in my coverage, about 100 technical professionals.
And just for my interest, which 9 countries are those? Which part?
I'm just going to have to run through and make sure I don't forget any. So let me see. Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Korea, Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Right. So they're a group, under the APAC umbrella. That gives me my coverage. So those technical professionals work with data and AI tools in our customers, and I sometimes think of myself as a talent coordinator. So I encourage them to also keep learning and be an evangelist, and that maintains their relevancy and ultimately helps our customers also use these technologies to better themselves and their services.
Talent coordinator. That's definitely one that I'm gonna put on a towel. You should make that your LinkedIn job title. So we're just talking about those 9 different countries. As you know, I'm located in one of those countries that you visit. It's Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. And I also travel a lot around the region, very similar countries that you are visiting. And what I'm always amazed with is different speeds of adoption, different focus on technology. Some governments are very forward-looking when it comes towards data and AI. Other ones are more protective in the sense that they say, this is all nice, but let's not go too fast. Let's put in regulations first. So just wondering a little bit around your perspective. Where do you see quickest progress and why? But also maybe the other side of it. Where do you think there are most steps still to take?
And it's quite interesting because across those 9 countries are very different paces of, if you like, technology market. Mm-hmm. So, the big countries like Australia and Singapore, for example, probably have more mature investments in this space, very much a practice. I spent a lot of my time working in Australia and New Zealand for many years, and moving out to these countries has been quite eye-opening. What has surprised me, particularly since the advent of COVID, is the speed of digital transformation in many, many countries. So it's encouraging to know that in our region, we had about 4 to 5 years of digital transformation investment in the first year of COVID alone. And that acceleration has only increased. So before that, many agencies and countries were still doing things very manually. and face to face. Having traveled across the hub, I've been surprised at the drive and enthusiasm in this space. The three countries in particular that I recently visited was Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam have very aggressive AI roadmaps and initiatives. They are government sponsored, so high stakeholder vetting. Historically, very low adoption, so they're kind of springboarding this. But some of those markets are almost seeing this as like a new digital economy. So the advent in these tools and technologies, making that accessible to them is seen as a huge opportunity. Some other markets like Malaysia, really strong investment, particularly in financial and government sectors. So they continue to drive and grow in that space. Some other environments like Australia in particular is going through an advent of regulation, right? And an understanding now that while there's been some capabilities out there, we have a number of incidences, everything from cyber breaches to deep fake AI media, that is creating an awareness of ethics and responsibility that could potentially work with innovation, but is causing, if you like, some pause in adoption. I think between that,
they push the brake a little bit more because they have more to lose, or because they are at such a maturity level that their processes and regulatory framework kind of mandates them to take things a little bit slower.
I think it's a case with particularly in the Australian market environment, there is a lot of regulation in many industries. And for example, if we look at ChatGPT, some key organisations in federal have set a moratorium on it, that they will not be working or investigating those technologies until federal regulation has become more clear. But other agencies and departments are using it quite aggressively. Yeah. So there's quite a mix there. And I guess if you wait for a single strategy, that will take some time.
Yeah, and before that strategy is being developed, that could take a couple of years. So one of the predecessors, or the person who was before you on this podcast, was from the Malaysia Digital Economy Corporation, MDEC in Malaysia. I'm quite sure you're familiar. And he shared a perspective around, the adoption of big data, AI, as we as countries. With each other, we're also in a competition, and the only way forward is to make sure that we don't prohibit that. We start embracing these kind of new technologies, because otherwise we might not be relevant anymore for companies to open up a specific branch in our country, or they might go somewhere else. So do you share that kind of statements that data and AI basically provides countries to gain a competitive advantage as well?
I certainly see AI in general as a competitive enabler. And what is interesting in the global economy is that some of the challenges traditionally around either skills or resourcing, accessibility in these tools have been moved drastically. And I think that certain countries I've been working with, they do see huge potential here. Many of the organizations, the countries in region, have a very young population. So I think the average age of a Filipino citizen is actually as young as 24. And Vietnam, I think, is 26.
1 year older than you.
It was quite interesting to be in the Philippines after 20 years. Half of them hadn't been there when I was there last, but it's a very young, dynamic region, and that has also meant that the ability to uptake skills has also increased, because it's a younger, more curious population. So I think we do see a global competitive advantage, and that ability to service the globe is very much of interest. Many years ago, we recognized there were not enough data scientists, and there was a huge effort to try and train and skill more. If anything, technology has helped assist in making tools more accessible and improving skills. But that ability for tech-savvy knowledge workers, I think, is the ongoing future demand. And any workforce would benefit from that in a digital economy.
So I think it's the thing you're mentioning specifically around skills and knowledge that you need in order to kind of operate all these solutions. That's going to be a very critical aspect that we're going to see in the next few years, and also main challenges how to address that. So you visit a lot of clients. I'm quite sure they have similar concerns and similar questions, but what I'd like to learn a little bit more from you is how do they address skills gap? So they probably also don't have a whole team of data scientists ready to go. So with these new tools, with these new solutions, how do you make sure that people are properly educated, trained, but also knowledgeable on how to use that?
Yes. So one thing that has, I think, swung the ability to skills to become more democratized, if you like, is the open source community.
Yeah.
So the building of open source now has become, used to be considered separate to business and innovation, is now inclusive in that network. And I think what the open source community has done is make tools and skills and capabilities of baseline much more available. And whether that's through people who are curious or through academia or just through general research and development, that is now a huge ecosystem. That has helped. One area as well is that the technology itself has also improved in, if you like, its accessibility. We talk about things in AI now like prompt engineering.
Yeah. I saw that as well.
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting. Not many people know that when they're interacting with Chat GPT, they are being the prompt engineer.
Yeah.
That is actually how simple and accessible some tools are.
I'm going to put that on my LinkedIn profile.
Yeah. So you're a GPT prompt engineer. And I think that that has made technology adoption much easier, but we've also become more data aware, right, as knowledge capital workers. And it used to be a case of, well, I know this information is somewhere. How do I find out? And now we've got more accessible catalogs and corporate directories. We can start to do more self-service. When you start to feed self-service, you start to increase data literacy as well. And when you improve that literacy, you then have a foundation for increased skill adoption. And many people now, even in their late professional careers, are pivoting to pick up some of these tools and technologies because their interest and demand is there.
Absolutely. So I think because it's such a fascinating kind of magic thing that's happening, or at least from my personal perspective, I kind of want to see how it's working and understand how things like that are being generated. And that brings me to one of the points that you said around being a prompt engineer or somebody basically that knows how to use these tools, which I fully share is obviously one of the main starting points, because otherwise there's not going to be any value of using that technology. But if we think about it a little bit deeper, basically what we are doing is we are giving people a big black box to start putting in prompts. They get knowledge out of it, but there is no visibility into what is happening under the hood. And I was the other day in a conversation with somebody that said, well, that's not really relevant because if you're driving a car, you also don't know how all the wiring is going through the car. You cannot literally see how everything is connected, and you still are able to drive a car. And most people have no clue how it works. So and they still get from A to B. Is that a good analogy for these AI tools as well? Or should we say, well, this is such a relevant development. We should definitely know what's happening under the hood. And people, in order to be data literate, should also know a little bit more around the mechanics to kind of make the same car analogy of how it's working. What's your view?
I would agree that we should know more. And I'm always concerned if someone says, it's a black box and it just works, that's okay. That's fine until an accident, right? And then you need to...
Same page as you.
and I think also one of the barriers to some of these technology has been that that fear, if you like, or lack of explainability. Explainability to me is vitally important if you are assisting decision making or business outcomes. There is a difference between being, let's say, an AI consumer, for example. If I use a tool for creative input or get recommendations on like my streaming service for next programs, that's okay. I can take or leave that, right? And a lot of organizations are doing that for consumer services. That's fine. But if I'm in a business role, and this is very much an area of AI development IBM is focused in, your stakes are much higher, right? You have to be auditable and accountable for your outcome. We actually have a fundamental principle in IBM on our AI ethics that explainability is one of the core tenets of this software. So yes, you can use these models, but you should also be tuning and correcting for things like bias, unfairness, accuracy, ultimately delivering some kind of trust or confidence index while still maintaining privacy of information and security. So I'm absolutely 100% on the innovation bandwagon, but I am also, as a proponent of responsible AI, a keen practitioner in understanding how that becomes a business-related outcome.
I think what the responsible AI, as you just referenced, is something that a lot of organizations are currently struggling with. I've probably never seen the word AI ethics used as much as since the beginning of this year. Last few years didn't exist, or at least it wasn't on anyone's radar. And you said something very interesting. You said, in our IBM AI ethics program, this is a fundamental principle. Could you explain a little bit how a massive organization like IBM is dealing with this very complicated subject matter?
Absolutely. IBM has a principle of being essential to the business, trying to use technology for good. We very early on adopted an AI ethics board, and it was built on some fundamental principles. One, that AI should be used to assist human decision making. So notice there it's more augmentation rather than independent decision making. So AI should be an assistant in decision making. The second principle was that your data is your sovereignty, right? Your information, your personal information, yours as a corporation is your asset and your subject matter expertise. So we value that as well. And the third is around these ethics or responsibility around explainability, bias, fairness, equality. These are things that we expect in our technology direction. And more importantly, we provide toolkits, AI toolkits that can help you assess and validate that. Since the council came together many years ago, what we've seen is increased demand across organizations, EU, America, the rest of the world, to create some guardrails around AI. And we've worked in combination with a number of agencies and countries that have followed similar ethical principles. So to us, that was vital in what we call responsible AI and technology for good. As interesting as that is also the principles on what IBM will not do. We have released things like fairness toolkits in the AI marketplace and open source community, but we did also categorically state we will no longer support visual or facial recognition technology for profiling. So that is something we made a conscious decision to step away from. And I think working with any software vendor or provider of technology, as a consumer or as a business, I actually have the right to ask, sorry, do you have a AI ethics charter or a data responsibility direction? Because that might influence how I work with you as a business.
So I think that a lot of organizations can learn from that. I'm quite sure that many of the people who are listening don't have an AI charter or ethics committee. And I think one of the main takeaways from today might be that it's useful to kind of start setting something up. One of the key aspects, or the critical, I would say, ethical challenges, if you want to call it that way, is obviously always between being a corporate, the drive and I would say the obligation even to make money, expand your business, be a commercial organization, and this AI ethics part. So if I listen to you correctly, you say, we phase out specific products if we think they're not in line with our ethical policy. But I suppose that you've sold a big AI toolkit to, let's say, a government agency or a big corporation, and you notice or you get signs in the market that it's not, or it's using those tools because ultimately it's who's behind the buttons, that they're using that for a not so ethical goal. Let me rephrase it carefully. What would you do? Because is it then going to get to a stage where you say, well, we as IBM, we will drop the client? Are we going to try to convince them to use it in another way? Is that even useful? Or is it ultimately not your responsibility in the sense that you're creating the software, the tools, and who uses an algorithm in a particular way? It's not something that you can always control. If somebody, and the reason I'm saying that, because I'm pretty sure you're going to say no to that last part, but if you're using a Microsoft text editor to write a rent note, then you can also not blame Microsoft for that. So I kind of want to pick your brain on that ethical part of it, because I think it's such a difficult discussion. I know there's no right or wrong, but just interesting to hear your thoughts.
It is interesting, and IBM as an organization, as long as it has been, has also been instrumental in certain points of history as a provider of technology. This is actually not new to us. So some of the ethical principles are bound by our corporate values, and we publish those, and essentially our mission is to be essential to the world and to business. And we pride ourselves in trust. Trust is our license to do business. So we are very mindful of the use cases and adoption of technology. Now, some of this is actually regulated, not just by IBM, but also globally. So as a US-based company, there are certain jurisdictions we cannot provide technology or sell into. You may even recall in some of the open source community, they have concepts like, must be used for good, for example. So there are principles and guidelines in place. However, at a fundamental point, technology and innovation is, if you like, a tool to an outcome. And it's always the motivation and desire of human beings that leads to the outcome. Now, from my perspective, if we talk the big picture of AI and the responsibility of the outcome there, that's why I think humans need to be in the loop, right? It's an accountability point. Now, if IBM did become aware of technology investment that was not in line with our values, then there would definitely be a conversation around that. I can't recall a similar incident in my time, but it's certainly there are ethical guiding principles in our terms and conduct guidelines. But in terms of driving awareness and accountability and responsibility at a global level, we see ourselves as a software vendor as to also help support and explain that. And for that reason, that's why we do have that seriousness of investment and those principles, and work with regulation agencies, both globally and so forth, in help setting those guidelines. So I think it's not a single technology vendor here who would be accountable to the outcome. This is a community consensus of what we want to drive as a civilization, right? And as technology adopters. So it is a big question. Yeah. Unfortunately, I can't give you a simple answer because this is ethics, right? This is a big...
I fully aware it's not a simple answer, but that's also what makes these discussions always so very, very interesting.
Yes, I agree. Yes, and there should be no, we've seen some recently, some discussions in the US, the head of OpenAI talking about how there should be guardrails and principles involved. And I would agree. But of course, as a software vendor, I also have a responsibility in providing the technology as well.
I think that we're going to see a lot of that regulation coming to the market very, very quickly because of these developments. Good, Kieran. So one of the purposes of this podcast, you probably know it, or at least you've seen it before, is that we also have a lot of listeners that kind of want to go beyond the basics, and we're always trying to dive a little bit deeper than we might be able to get online. And one of the main topics that I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into with you is specifically data management, because we have been talking a lot around AI algorithms, but it ultimately is only going to work if there are the storage systems, the databases, the cloud solutions, basically all the things that IBM sells on a day-to-day basis in order to power that. And I think that that's a component that not a lot of people realize or know about. So I wanted to pick your brain a little bit around what is data management, how can an organization, government, or a large organization do that well, and what are the key components to it. So for everyone who's new to this topic, can you explain a little bit around what data management is and why it's so important?
Yeah, absolutely. To me, data is the building blocks of information. It is the raw element, if you like, that is the basis of an action or an outcome.
Yeah.
And if we think about data management holistically, the provision of an element, a data element into an outcome is to me like an information supply chain. So fundamentally, most environments or information management technologies will have a number of key components. One is the collection area, so the storage of those data elements, system of record or warehouse, whatever that may be. So that's the raw data element that exists within an enterprise today. Next would be organizing that information.
Mm-hmm.
It could be as simple as integration points between one system to another. It could be a semantic catalog explaining what that content is and where it goes. So that's the second layer, connecting those data elements to other point systems. The third bit is analysis. That's where data becomes actionable. So we talked a bit about like SPSS earlier. That's to analyze that information, drive insights, gain awareness into a product line or service. And the ultimate outcome is infusing it, or the acting or interoperating with that information through an application, a terminal, a keyboard, a phone, or a device. So if you think about that provisioning, the data management challenge is everything on that information supply chain. The storage of those building elements, linking them together, doing analysis with it, and then feeding the end user. That to me is classical information management. What's interesting is new architectures like data fabrics, for example, are based on those same principles. So regardless of whether it's a data lakehouse or a data mesh, the same principles of information delivery apply. And those challenges have been as long as record keeping has been around.
They've been around for a very, very long time, not to understate that. So every organization is at a point A, and I've seen organizations where it's fairly well arranged to the spectrum of where it's a complete mess and anything in between. I don't have met a lot of organizations that say, in terms of data management, we are a 10 out of 10. So suppose that we have an organization that is at a point A, somebody's listening today says, well, I would really like to professionalize my data management, or data management, I should say, in your part of the world, to go from point A to point B. So I need a data management strategy. How do I build one? Where do I start? What should I do besides calling you?
Which you can do too. So there is, if you like, a maturity assessment, right? To understand where people are on their journey. So to me, I do think of this sometimes as like a ladder, an evolution in capability. Many small organizations are quite content to have what they call data silos, just pockets of storage across the enterprise. That's fine. But at a certain scale, you need to link and integrate that to drive efficiencies and outcome. So I've always thought the best place to start was in that organized layer, right? Because that to me is an area of investment that actually drives forward to many other things. You can always use an application off the shelf. You can always use analysis tools to get a point outcome. But if you want to evolve as an enterprise, or from our perspective, become what we call a data decision-making organization, to me, the organized layer is the most important, because that gives you line of sight on all your information assets. So first you get sight, then you can understand its impact. So operationally, that's got a lot of efficiency. If I lose this system, if I lose this report, what's the impact? Who are the end users? I can notify that. But
So
to me, that
also,
also...
does that mean that you also classify that data in your information layer in terms of its importance?
Yes, yes. And this is the beauty of it. By creating that semantic awareness of what you have, you can start to build classification categories of that business context. So we talk occasionally about data sitting in a table or column is just technical, right? But within that has meaning. For example, an email address, a person's phone number. These are business elements. And what we want to do is link technical and business context together. That is how knowledge workers actually want to use information. That's one of the big advents actually in some of the AI and natural language processing, is asking the context and then getting the technical answer. So to me, that's a great enabler to more effective data management across the organization. And once you know and can classify your objects, you can introduce new things like governance, security, regulated access, and self-service. And that to me is a great springboard to a data-driven decision-making.
Thank you. Can I ask, is it also possible then to add, let's say, trust to that specific data element? Could I say, is this a trustworthy piece or a trustworthy database or something like that?
And this is quite topical, right, in terms of breaking down these black box of the algorithms. So to me, trust comes in two forms. There can be an objective basis, like let's say a data profiling exercise that can give you accuracy of this is always a number, this is always a credit card, for example. That's one level of trust and authenticity. What's interesting is, though, that we also encourage people to have almost a social element as well. So if people are making decision makings, they can actually rate, star ratings on their data or their quality, and say, this comes from the corporate report, it is known to be of a high standard. Or someone could say, this is actually a really good repository for X, Y, and Z marketing outcome. So trust is really about building a confidence level and then acting on that confidence level in a accurate and business orientated way. If you get that correct, then you are building trust.
Yeah. I think that that's a very interesting discussion. And the reason I'm kind of bringing this up is because I was in a conference in Middle East a few weeks ago. And there we had a bit of a discussion around how do you make sure that the data that we're using in an enterprise is used in a valid way and we can use it to trust things. And one of the discussions that really came up, and you might or might not know that I'm a big advocate of this, is a data catalog.
Yes.
And basically what we were showcasing or what we were discussing is, wouldn't it be nice if every organization has this repository, this catalog, just like a clothing catalog, where you could say, these are the data sets that we have, but where people can also indicate, just as you say, I trust this data set, or hey, dear colleague XYZ, you should check out this data set because it works really well. Is that what is going to be the future in terms of organizing this data? And what are your thoughts on that?
The technology is available now. Certainly we use it in IBM, in our own CIO office. We have a knowledge catalog with, if you like, a personal social weighting index. I could see that, creating this semantic layer helps with many things. Ultimately, when we think of productivity, a lot of our time is spent looking for things. Imagine you're a data scientist with a deadline.
Yeah.
80% of your time could be spent trying to find the data, massage it, put it into a format before you actually build it or use anything with it in analysis. And sometimes data scientists have found that data is duplicated or irrelevant.
Mhm.
And it's because they didn't get that insight when they went looking for it in the first place. So we've got very advanced automation capabilities now that can give you the baseline quality index or the context as you connect the source. And that is a great productivity tool. If you get that right and then add further value elements, I suppose you could say, like its usage downstream, its currency, its accuracy, its validity. These are sometimes more subjective measures, but add an element as well. That can certainly be introduced on top. But even just collection of a corporate catalog can be a huge productivity lift to anyone in an organization.
Yeah, it's really an amazing part because I fully share that opinion. And I think that having a good enterprise data catalog also forces you to really start thinking about that semantic layer underneath, as well as your data management bricks underneath it. But just from my experience, there's so very, very few organizations that do it at all or do it right
Yeah.
to start with. So maybe you could better explain this than I can, but why is this so difficult to get right? Because as you rightfully mentioned, the technology exists. I've seen a lot of very good solutions, including the ones from IBM. But why is it so difficult to get this right?
I think some of it comes from history of investment. When we think about classic data management initiatives, they used to be IT shop and
Mhm.
warehouse driven. That used to be, 80s, 90s when these systems became introduced. And then they had to respond to business demand, right? And business demand was like an avalanche. Knowledge workers wanted more and more data. So the historic or the legacy systems were kind of rigid. They were a left to right process flow. It was a change request. It was very governed and structured, but it was IT driven. And
Mhm.
having been a coder myself, you should never ask me to write the description document as well as the code. They are very different things. We used to take a business request and laugh at it because it could be completely unrelated to the code delivered. It's just a reality. So these systems became largely undocumented, right? The first thing that was dropped in a project deadline was documentation.
Sure.
What has happened, and as you mentioned, is technology has helped move that forward. A lot of agencies didn't want to invest time in the cataloging of information because it required subject matter expertise and sometimes coordination between many agencies and departments that wasn't their priority. So the trick became I can now automate a lot of that. So if I can give you a baseline, now your knowledge experts can also feed into this loop. Because one thing we learned very early in our cataloging tools and technologies is never try for consensus. If you wait for consensus, you'll never get a catalog. If you provide a baseline and allow people to contribute or correct it, then it becomes living. And I think it's an attitude that takes a maturity or awareness to democratize, if you like, that information feeding. We call them knowledge capital workers, and now there's some very convincing ROI on sharing that domain expertise through a catalog lives longer than the employment of the employee.
Yeah, absolutely. A term I saw coming by a few weeks ago was data stewards, people who are
Yes.
really proactively trying to keep that information correctly. But I think you're kind of touching upon some of the historic challenges, legacies, but also I think mentality that we need in order to make this work. Um, Taking it one level of abstraction higher. So we talked about the data catalogs within enterprise, maybe even at a government level. I know that a lot of governments are busy with creating open data sets. I'm quite sure in Australia that's the case and in other countries as well. You see a lot of effort around doing that. But if we take that one step higher, is there ever going to be a data catalog where we will have access to everything, in your opinion?
Quite interesting. I mean, arguably, the internet is kind of like based on that premise. The concept, it's quite interesting. From the concept, if we think about AI models, and we're aware of some very prominent models out there, large language models, for example. My opinion and the perspective of a technologist is that there will never be one model to rule them all. That's not the point. The amount of compute, the currency, the collection of information there becomes overwhelming, right? So I see more value in tailored models, and you can see that in the open source community. And I think the same with catalogs as well. And the reason is context, right? Because if you have a single point of access for everything, if I come in as a database administrator, I'm looking for something different. I'm looking for technical insight. If I'm coming in as a report user, I'm actually looking for business context. Now, if I only get one result, that's not going to be productive necessarily to some of my users. So the cataloging collection of information has been phenomenal. In human history, you'd have to say the amount of data collection that is out there is incredibly impressive in terms of compute and storage. Having said that, IBM, in its own model design, curated what we call Blue Pile. Blue Pile is vetted, known, trusted information sources that we use to train our foundation models. That's 14 petabytes of data, and it has trillions of decision point parameters. That, though, is curated content. So again, it's subjective to a business outcome, but it's also trusted and vetted. That's what we invest in to get a particular outcome. For many organizations, you can outsource it, which means you're inherently generic, or you can tune it to your business need. And I think that's a practical outcome of people who are doing decision making.
So ultimately, if I summarize it a little bit, it's still around the context within which you're going to be using that data to kind of determine what the value will be. Is that
absolutely? Yeah. Yeah.
Good. We're almost getting towards the end of the hour. I could easily talk to you for another one. But there's always one question that I ask all of my guests just to kind of have a bit of a diverse perspective, because the whole reason that we started this Big Data Talks show is to basically inspire people and help them learn around the way in which data machine learning is changing the way that we are living in. Somebody's now listening and he's a young student and really would like to accelerate, would like to become a leader in the field based on all your years of experience. And they have very strong ambitions in AI, machine learning. What would be your main recommendation in terms of what they should look at, what they should maybe even study, or what they should move and do next in their steps?
Yes. So it's interesting. It's almost like when we started out, we talked about, so what interests you in data? There are some key principles I believe in for anyone who wants to work with these tools or technologies. The one fundamental principle is be curious, right? This is one of the fastest moving fields in industry innovation. We're at an advent here, a revolution. So my advice is fundamentally be curious. Try some of these tools and technologies and apply them. The second thing is don't be afraid to learn and experiment. So there are a number of really good open source community websites, and even from IBM, we have a hosting community site, making these tools accessible with tutorials and enablement to get you started. When looking at that huge options, if you like, choose a natural area of interest, something that's relevant to you. I've had a number of people who started out, obviously my interest was in biological anthropology, looking at theories on evolution, but some people are interested in potentially engineering or cooking or weather, and each of those has an entry point into this space that you could use and leverage. So be curious, adapt and learn, and you could be one of those AI knowledge workers we talked about that is the future of the digital economy.
Right.
Um,
Well, I think that is probably one of the best summaries that I've ever heard. So be curious, adapt and learn, and become the next AI leader. Maybe we should summarize it at that.
Well, I highly encourage people in interviews. These are the skills that make you essential.
I'm going to send you a towel with that quote.
That's fantastic.
It's been an absolute pleasure having you here. I always really enjoy talking to you. Your words of wisdom are greatly appreciated. I'm quite sure that a lot of listeners are going to be very interested in this perspective. So thanks so much for sharing your ideas around data management, AI, ethics, and everything in between. Absolute pleasure to talk to you, Kieran.
Fantastic. I really enjoyed it, Jan. Thanks so much for inviting me. It was fun.